The road to Jerusalem begins with sea salt. Close your eyes for a moment and picture this. It's the early 1190s. Winter still bites in Europe, seeping into stone walls. But every road leading south opens into the scent of salt and the promise of warmer winds. I'm standing with you at the edge of a harbor. The wooden pier groans, ropes strain, and sails tremble as they catch the breeze. And in the crowd, one name keeps returning like a drumbeat. Richard the Lionheart. I'm not going to give you a distant fairy tale. I won't skim across it with vague, what if I were there lines. I'm going to pull you into it like a field journal. Ports to fortresses, open sea to siege trenches, hunger and disease to strategy and pride. We'll move through real geography, the harsh shores of Cyprus, the scorched hills of Palestine, the foul-smelling ditches outside Acre, and the wind-hammered walls of Jaffa. I'll tell it the way I would tell a close friend, intimate, direct, but with the clarity of a documentary, because this crusade was not only a war of swords, it was a war of logistics, of wind direction, of water wells, of rations, and of leaders who could not afford to blink. Quick note for the channel. If you enjoy this story and want me to continue with more long-form documentary-style narrations, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And don't forget to like this video. We genuinely need your support to keep producing stories like this. Chapter 1. A crusade that begins at sea. Harbor, storm, and the Gate of Cyprus. I'll be honest with you. Joining a crusade isn't defined by battle at first. It's defined by departure. Because before you ever see an enemy banner, you learn that the first force that can break you is the sea. Our ship is broad-bellied, built for carrying more than fighting. Barrels stacked below deck, salted meat, hardtack, wine skins, bundles of arrows and spare bowstrings tucked into corners. Above, soldiers crowd the planks, mercenary archers, knights fussing over buckles and straps, men polishing metal as if shine could protect them. The air is tar and sweat, with the constant rasp of iron against iron. When we leave the harbor, the excitement is real, but so is the silence, because the sea has a way of stripping away the illusion that you're in control. Out on the Mediterranean, geography stops being a map and becomes a living thing. One day the wind pushes your back like a blessing. The next day it slaps your face like punishment. The sun turns armor into an oven. At night, dew settles over the deck like a cold hand. And water, real drinking water, becomes the most valuable substance you own. Waste a mouthful and you'll regret it the next day the way you regret a betrayal. And then, the storm. I won't dress it up. A storm is the moment you realize there is sea everywhere, even inside your bones. Waves slam the hull until the ship sounds like it's moaning. Ropes whip like wet snakes. For a second, if the mast stops creaking, you don't think quiet, you think broken. That's when people learn to pray, not just the pious, everyone. In that chaos, Richard's presence, his authority, becomes even more visible. At sea, titles matter less than composure. His men are disciplined. Orders are short. Movements clean. Even early in the expedition, you understand something crucial. Richard isn't only a fighter. He's an organizer, the kind of man who can impose structure on panic. The storm drives us toward Cyprus. I remember the first sight of the coast, jagged rocks, narrow coves, green slopes rising behind them. Cyprus sits in the Mediterranean like a lock on the eastern sea lanes. Whoever controls it controls the pulse of the route to the Levant. When we land, The ground is hot and dry. Around the harbor, markets are cautious, faces guarded. Our men look for water, for timber, for pitch to seal cracks and repair hulls. It becomes clear quickly that Cyprus won't be just a stop. It's political ground. It's leverage. It's a supply guarantee. Walking beside you along that coast, I would say, this island isn't scenery. In a crusade, places like Cyprus are the insurance policy for the entire campaign. Because the real enemy of an army moving east is often not Saladin's cavalry. It's hunger, disease, and delayed supplies. In Cyprus, discipline tightens. Rations are counted, barrels are sealed, horses are inventoried, armor straps are checked. Rust here is practically a death sentence because moisture weakens blades, loosens bowstrings, infects wounds. An archer once told me, very plainly, the worst enemy isn't a man, it's damp. And then we sail again. East is ahead. On a map, Holy Land is just ink. In reality, it's weight, heavy enough to press against your ribs. Chapter 2, the breath of Acre. Under the walls, the stench of ditches, and the war of waiting. The first time we see Acre, it doesn't look like a city. It looks like resistance made of stone. The walls stand close to the sea with a tight strip of shoreline between water and fortification. Behind the city, roads open into flatter land, and beyond that, hills. Hills where Saladin's forces can appear like a moving shadow. Here is what people rarely tell you. The hardest part of a siege isn't swinging a sword. The hardest part is waiting. Because a siege is a long calculation. When does stone arrive for the trebuchets? How long do wells last? When does dysentery begin killing more men than arrows? The answers matter more than heroic speeches. When we pitch camp, even the earth smells different. Damp, heavy, mixed with rot from trenches and refuse pits. Everywhere is the sound of construction, siege towers framed in fresh-cut timber, earthworks dug deeper, engines assembled. The trebuchets' wooden arms bake under the sun, drying and cracking, yet every launch sends a boulder flying like a piece of the earth ripped loose and hurled at the city's nerves. When Richard arrives, the atmosphere changes. His presence straightens backs. Sometimes he's at the front like a warrior. Sometimes he's measuring angles like an engineer. He studies weak points, watches wind direction, coordinates supply from sea. His power isn't only courage, it's his ability to set a tempo, work by day, watch by night, inspections at dawn. But Acre is a place that eats you from the inside. Heat brings flies. Flies bring disease. Men die not from enemy arrows, but from their own bodies turning against them. I'm going to be blunt. Camp illness is more ruthless than combat. It's invisible, ordinary, and absolutely lethal. Days pass and a strange normal forms. The engines fire, archers trade volleys, trenches widen, fear becomes routine. The man who flinched at the first whistle of an arrow is, a week later, breaking bread under that same sound. And geography keeps shaping everything. The side facing the sea catches cooler wind. The interior camp takes the full burn of the sun. The soil hardens, turning digging into labor. Footprints on mud become footprints on dust. Everything feels scarce. Shade, water, sleep. Eventually, the walls crack, the city surrenders, and the victory doesn't arrive like triumph. It arrives like exhaustion. Acre falls, but what remains is burned streets, the sharp scent of smoke, the greed of looting, and a harsh truth. This is only the opening act. Now the campaign becomes clear. Secure the coastline, keep the supply line alive, then turn toward the interior, toward Jerusalem. But remember this, the road to Jerusalem is not a straight line. It's a chain of ports, castles, and hard choices. Chapter 3. The Coastal March and Arsuf. Steel at the edge of forest and sand. The day we leave Acre, the army looks like a moving river. Scouts in front, archers on the flanks, knights at the center, supply wagons and pack animals behind. The coastal route is chosen for a reason. The sea can feed you. Ships can shadow the march, bringing grain, water, tools, medicine. In a crusade, that advantage is everything. But the coast isn't easy. On one side is the Mediterranean. On the other are inland hills, terrain where Saladin can move fast. His light cavalry doesn't always strike to destroy us in one blow. Often, the goal is to wear us down, to fray discipline, to break rhythm, to invite panic. Let me tell you this the way I would tell you as we walk. An army is most vulnerable, not when it fights, but when it marches. On the march, men are hungry, thirsty, distracted. Armor bites into shoulders. Feet blister, animals spook, and a sudden shower of arrows, a scream, a misheard command, those are the moments when formation collapses. Near Arsuf, the terrain shifts. Sandy stretches, patches of woodland, rising ground inland. The heat turns heavier with coastal humidity. Saladin tries to press us where maneuver is limited. A narrow corridor close to the shore, little room to spread. When the fighting begins, the first sound you truly register isn't swords. It's horses breathing, then arrows. The enemy cavalry moves like a swarm, fast, striking, withdrawing. Our shields lift, spears set. Discipline becomes the difference between survival and disaster. Richard's order is firm. Do not break formation. Do not charge too early. Because a premature charge stretches the line, splits the army, and makes you easy to isolate and destroy. Arsuf's critical moment is the thin line between endurance and collapse. There is a point where a unit feels it can't take another minute of arrow fire, heat, and thirst. Your blood demands forward motion. That is exactly the moment an enemy wants you to lose control. Richard chooses the timing, waits until the pressure peaks, then unleashes the counterattack. And when it comes, the knights advance like a wall learning to run. Steel flashes under the sun, hooves carve tracks into sand. The instant of impact feels strangely slow. A shield taking a blow, a spear snapping, a horse twisting sideways, a man falling with a sound you never forget. Arsuf is not just a battle, it's a message. This army will not break. Saladin withdraws. But victory does not feel like celebration. It feels like the body's confession that it is tired. Everyone knows the truth. Jerusalem still waits, and the hardest part is ahead. Chapter 4, the shadow of Jerusalem, Jaffa, and the hard face of peace. The closer we move toward Jerusalem, the air changes. The damp coastal wind fades. Nights become colder, sharper. The landscape grows barer, more stone, fewer trees. Water sources thin out. And if you and I stood on a ridge together, looking out over shimmering heat and rocky valleys, we would hear the same question in the silence. If we reach it, can we hold it? Here is the documentary. Truth. Taking a city is one problem. Keeping it is another. Even if Jerusalem fell, supply lines would stretch. Wells might remain under enemy control. Winter could turn roads into misery. A holy prize can become a strategic trap. Richard understands this. Saladin understands it too. That is why the final phase of the campaign is written not only in blood, but in negotiation. Envoys travel back and forth. Conditions are tested. Pride and practicality collide. The war continues at the table because diplomacy is another battlefield. Meanwhile, The coastal strongholds matter more than ever, especially Jaffa. Jaffa is one of the gateways inland. Lose it, and the entire coastal chain fractures. Saladin's pressure there is not accidental. It's the logic of war. Strike the hinge. The defense of Jaffa, believe me, turns days into weeks. The wind on the walls is harsh. The sea churns below. In the harbor, ships represent hope, supplies, reinforcements, medicine. Below the battlements, assault ladders rise, arrows hiss, stones crash. The sound of combat here is sharper because it echoes off stone and water. Richard's sudden arrival becomes a turning point. Coming by sea, restoring order, knitting scattered defenders back into a line. This is where leadership looks less like glory and more like engineering, rebuilding morale as if it were a damaged wall. But every recovery has a cost. Men are lost. Food is burned through, bodies begin to move like machines running out of oil. And then the final curtain, an agreement. It would be dishonest to label it simply victory or defeat. Jerusalem is not captured, yet terms are reached that allow Christian pilgrims access under certain conditions, and the Crusaders retain parts of the coastal corridor. Both sides understand the mathematics of exhaustion. The swords stop, not because pride disappears, but because further struggle threatens to destroy what remains. If we were sitting by a campfire, at the end, I would tell you quietly, history doesn't always end the way men imagine it will, but it still moves forward, and we return carrying memories heavier than armor. Jerusalem remains, in a sense, a horizon made of ideas. But what the campaign teaches is brutally clear. Geography, water, disease, supply, diplomacy, these are as real as any blade. And the most factual truth of all, after marching with Richard the Lionheart, is this: heroism is not always charging forward. Sometimes it is building a system strong enough to keep breathing. Closing, one last reminder. If you stayed with me to the end, you're already part of this story's world. If you want more long, chapter-based, documentary-style narrations like this, subscribe if you haven't. And like the video. Your support is what makes it possible to keep producing this kind of work. Thank you for listening. We'll walk together again in the next story.